Today I'm going over the section in chapter 7 called From Vigilance to Peace. Although you can love the sonship only as one, you can perceive it as fragmented, right? That's what we're all doing. Really, the sonship is one. We are all one, but we are perceiving it as fragmented, as lots and lots of different people and things and creatures all over. It is impossible, however, to see something in part of it that you will not attribute to all of it. So again, we're all one. So anything we see in something that appears to be a separate fractal, a separate being, is really in all of us because there's only one of us. That is why attack is never discrete and why it must be relinquished entirely. So he's not talking about physical attack with behavior and bodies in the world. He's talking about attack in our mind. And what he means by that is when we perceive people as separate individual beings and not as a whole sonship, and then we are projecting out our judgment onto those seemingly separate beings. That whole routine that we're all doing all the time because we think we're here and therefore we are identified with ego, that routine is not discrete. Meaning no thoughts are private, meaning all minds are joined. So anything that we think or perceive, everyone else is receiving that same message unconsciously. That's why attack is never discrete. It's actually shared with our one mind. So whenever we're judging others, really we're judging ourselves because there's only one of us. And that's why he's saying it needs to be relinquished entirely, because if we want to wake up and heal our mind and return our mind to wholeness and oneness, we have to relinquish attack. We have to stop perceiving others out in the world as separate from us, something to project our guilt onto and judge. We have to stop doing that. We have to change our perception in our mind to see everyone as the innocent child of God. And then we can heal our mind. And guess what? Those thoughts are also not discrete. When we have healing thoughts, when we have loving thoughts, when we see everyone as the innocent child of God, those thoughts are also not discrete because all minds are joined. So that is how we help others to awaken, is by perceiving correctly within our own mind. If it is not relinquished entirely, it is not relinquished at all. Again, he's talking about how we perceive degrees and steps within our illusory world, but it's not true. There are no degrees and steps. There's just beingness, which is what we really are and what we're really doing right now with God in heaven, which is the state of oneness, extending love eternally. That's our true being. But we're asleep having a dream that we are separate and that there's all sorts of separate beings out there. And we attack those beings all the time, not just by having attacking mean thoughts, right? When we're judging or we're projecting our unconscious guilt onto others and blaming others and saying it's the world's fault for our non-peace. Not only that, but simply seeing others as separate. So even if you haven't gone so far to attack another in your mind and judge and blame another for something, simply by seeing them as a separate being, even if your thoughts are neutral about them, but you still think they're separate from you, that is still an attack according to the Course, because there's only one problem and one solution that we have. The one problem is that we think we are separate from God, and the one solution is that that is not true. And to know that and perceive that within ourselves, to perceive the oneness, and that solves the problem. That takes away the idea of separation. Then we know that we are whole and one. So that's why within the illusion, we can't just forgive a little bit. We can't just see some people as the innocent child of God and not others. There's no degrees of difficulty. And that's why he's saying, if it's not relinquished entirely, it's not relinquished at all. Because you can't just do it a little bit. You have to relinquish it entirely, meaning that you completely give up ego's separate identification for yourself and everyone and everything else that appears to be in the multiverse. That's how we give it up entirely. Fear and love make or create, depending on whether the ego or the Holy Spirit begets or inspires them. But they will return to the mind of the thinker, and they will affect his total perception. Okay, so fear and love make or create, because fear is of the ego and egos make. Love is of spirit and spirit creates. So whether we make or create, meaning identifying with ego or identifying with spirit, depends on whether the ego or the Holy Spirit begets or inspires them. Meaning, are you going to resist Holy Spirit, or are you going to be inspired by Holy Spirit? Remember, Holy Spirit is just the right part of your mind, the higher aspect of your mind. And then he says, but they will, he puts will in italics, but they will return to the mind of the thinker, and they will affect his total perception. Meaning, whatever thoughts you think are returned back to your mind immediately, because there's only one of us. So anything that you are thinking of everyone and everything else out there, you think about yourself. It comes right back to you. The universe, which is illusory, is reflective. It's a mirror. Whatever you put out is what you get right back. And that's within our mind. Don't think, oh, wait a minute, but I'm being nice and I'm being giving in the world, and that's not being given back to me. We're not talking about the illusory world. We're not talking about people's behavior. Okay? We can't act a certain way in the world and expect that behavior to be reflected back to us. The world doesn't work that way. The world's insane. The world is being run by the ego mind. Okay? So again, this is giving to get ego mentality. So what he's talking about here is our peace within ourselves, within our mind. That is what he means by whatever we think about others is what we're going to be thinking about ourselves. He's talking about peace, inner peace. That includes his concept of God, his creations, and of his own. He will not appreciate any of them if he regards them fearfully. He will appreciate all of them if he regards them with love. Right? This is why egos attack, because egos are afraid and egos are fearful of other egos in the world. But if we regard everything within the illusion through the perception of love, spirit love, okay, how we see people in our mind with our perception, then we will appreciate everyone and everything, because it's really just us. And when we heal our mind and experience that wholeness, experience that we are the one child of God, this brings us peace, and we will appreciate that. The mind that accepts attack cannot love. That's the ego mind. Egos cannot love, right? Here in our world, we have this thing that the Course calls special love, where we love certain people but not others. That's not real love. That's not the love he's speaking of. So the mind that accepts attack cannot love. That is because it believes it can destroy love, and therefore does not understand what love is. Right? Egos do not understand what love is. If it does not understand what love is, it cannot perceive itself as loving. This loses the awareness of being, induces feelings of unreality, and results in utter confusion. That's what we've done. That's what egos do. That's why we're so confused. Your thinking has done this because of its power. But your thinking can also save you from this because its power is not of your making. Okay, why? Why are we so powerful? Because we are of God. The power he's talking about is the same power that God has, which is the power of creation. But we made a mistake and we got confused and we miscreated. Meaning we made this illusory world with our ego perception. It was a mistake and we are confused. But we are incredibly powerful, and that's why we made this world. Because our thoughts are so powerful and we misthought and miscreated or made a world with our mind, in our mind. And now we just keep believing it. We're lost inside of a dream. It's an optical delusion, as Albert Einstein said. So we can use that same power that is within us, the power of our thinking that we got from God because we are one with God and the same as God. We can use that power to wake up. We can use it the opposite way that the ego is using it. Our power of our thinking can also save us from what is not of our making. Because when we are identified with the right part of our mind and identifying with our true home, this world is not of our making. Because it's not of God. Your ability to direct your thinking as you choose is a part of its power. So that's our power, the power of our choice. Are we going to choose ego or spirit? If you do not believe you can do this, you have denied the power of your thought and thus rendered it powerless in your belief. So he's talking about when we give up our power to choose, when we don't use it, when we don't even know that it's available to us. The ingeniousness of the ego to preserve itself is enormous, but it stems from the very power of the mind that the ego denies. So what he's saying is that the ego is ingenious, like it's an evil genius, and that the genius comes from the God part, but ego is always denying the God part. So that's why it's an evil genius. Because it took our power, the power that we have naturally from God, and misused it to then block out God. This means that the ego attacks what is preserving it, which must result in extreme anxiety. And this is where all the anxiety in the world is coming from. This is why the ego never recognizes what it is doing. It is perfectly logical, but clearly insane. The ego draws upon the one source that is totally inimical to its existence for its existence. Fearful of perceiving the power of this source, it is forced to depreciate it. This threatens its own existence, a state which it finds intolerable. Remaining logical, but still insane. The ego resolves this completely insane dilemma in a completely insane way. It does not perceive its existence as threatened by projecting the threat onto you and perceiving your being as non-existent. This ensures its continuance if you side with it by guaranteeing that you will not know your own safety. So he's describing basically, once again, the evil genius of the ego and how it uses logic in an insane way to guarantee that we will not know our safety. And he puts safety with a capital S, meaning spirit, heaven, oneness, love. We won't know that when we're falling for the ego's tricks. And the ego is very tricky. The ego cannot afford to know anything. Knowledge is total, and the ego does not believe in totality. So why can the ego not afford to know anything? Because as soon as we have knowledge, the ego is gone. The ego dies because knowledge is our truth. Ego doesn't want us to know that. And so that's why it doesn't believe in totality. It believes in separation, not oneness, not totality. This unbelief is its origin, right? Not believing in the oneness, not believing in God, not believing in heaven, believing that we are separate. So he's saying that this unbelief in our truth is its origin. That's how the ego came to be. And while the ego does not love you, right? The ego doesn't love us. It's not loving what the ego does. It is, he puts is in italics, faithful to its own antecedents, begetting as it was begotten. Mind always reproduces as it was produced. Produced by fear, the ego reproduces fear. This is its allegiance, and this allegiance makes it treacherous to love because you are love, right? If ego starts perceiving love, poof, the ego goes away. So it's treacherous to the ego for us to love. Love is your power, which the ego must deny. It must also deny everything this power gives you because it gives you everything, right? Spirit gives us everything. If we knew our truth, if we had that knowledge, the ego would disappear. So it fights tooth and nail for us to not know our truth. No one who has everything wants the ego. Right? He's saying that when we're awake and we know our truth, we don't want the ego. We have no interest in it. Its own maker then does not want it. That is hysterical. He's saying its own maker, which is us, doesn't really want it. How is this true? Because our mind is split. We have an ego mind and a spirit mind. Our ego mind does not want our truth, but our spirit self, which is our truth, does not want the ego. That's funny. Rejection is therefore the only decision the ego could possibly encounter if the mind that made it knew itself. Right? So he's saying that if we knew truth and we understood who and what we really were, we would reject the ego's thought system. And if it recognized any part of the sonship, it would know itself. Well, that's practicing forgiveness. That is when we recognize the sonship. That is what the Course is teaching us to do. And that is how we get to know ourselves. So by practicing forgiveness over and over and over again, every time that we can remember to do it, and remember, practicing forgiveness according to the Course means overlooking the illusory world, looking beyond all the separate things and people and beings that we see out there, and instead seeing the oneness, see the love and the light, see the truth of what's really there, knowing that we are all the one innocent child of God, perceiving correctly with the right part of our mind. That is practicing forgiveness. And that is how we awaken and know ourselves. The ego, therefore, opposes all appreciation, all recognition, all sane perception, and all knowledge. Fancy words to say that the ego completely rejects the spirit's perception. It, meaning the ego, perceives their threat as total because it senses that all commitments the mind makes are total. Forced, therefore, to detach itself from you, it is willing to attach itself to anything else. That's projection. But there is nothing else, right? The projection is an illusion. It's not even happening. The mind can, however, make up illusions. And if it does so, it will believe in them because that is how it made them. So he's just explaining how we made the whole thing up. We made up this false ego perception, this false story of victimization and separation. Then we reinforce it by projecting onto other people and attacking in our mind. And he's explaining how we've done this with illusion, because we are delusional when we are identifying with ego. The Holy Spirit undoes illusions without attacking them because he cannot perceive them at all. Why? Why can he not perceive them at all? Because they don't exist. Because the world's not really here. It's an illusion. So that's why Holy Spirit undoes illusions, the things that aren't really there. He shines light on them so that we can see that nothing is really there. They therefore do not exist for him, right? The illusions don't exist for Holy Spirit, which is the right part of our mind. So the illusions don't exist for us either when we are identified with Spirit. He resolves the apparent conflict they engender by perceiving conflict as meaningless. Right? The entire idea of conflict is coming from the ego. The ego is false. The ego is an illusion, and therefore it is meaningless. And Spirit knows this. I have said before that the Holy Spirit perceives the conflict exactly as it is. And it is, he puts in italics, meaningless. Right? So that's the truth. It's meaningless. It's not here. It's an illusion. The Holy Spirit does not want you to understand conflict. No, Holy Spirit doesn't want us to perceive or understand conflict. He wants you to realize that because conflict is meaningless, it is not understandable. Okay? When we are identified with the right part of our mind, we would never understand ego's perception. It is not understandable when we are perceiving correctly. As I have already said, understanding brings appreciation, and appreciation brings love. Nothing else can be understood because nothing else is real, and therefore nothing else has meaning. Beautiful words to remind us once again that we are spirit. Only spirit exists, which is the same as love. Only love exists. They are the only things that have meaning and the only things that are real. If you will keep in mind that what the Holy Spirit offers you, you cannot be vigilant for anything but God and his kingdom. So what he's saying is if we keep in mind the true gift that Holy Spirit has for us, that we would choose to be vigilant for God. We would not choose to keep identifying with ego if we really understood the gift that the Holy Spirit has for us. The only reason you may find this hard to accept is because you may still think there is something else. Belief does not require vigilance unless it is conflicted. We only need to be vigilant about choosing the right part of our mind because our mind appears to be conflicted. If there was no conflict, there would be no need for vigilance. If it is, there are conflicting components within it that have led to a state of war, and vigilance has therefore become essential. So that's what happens when we allow our mind to be taken over by the ego's perspective. We are then led to a state of war in our mind, and therefore we need vigilance to get us out of that. That's why vigilance becomes essential. Vigilance has no place in peace, okay? So when we're in peace, when we're identified with spirit, when we know who and what we and everyone else really is, there's no need for vigilance because then you're in peace. There's just beingness in peace. It is necessary against beliefs that are not true and would never have been called upon by the Holy Spirit if you had not believed the untrue. More fancy words to talk about why we need to be vigilant for God, because we are believing something that is untrue. When you believe what God does not know, your thought system seems to contradict his, and this makes it appear as if you are attacking him. So when we're identifying with ego, it makes it appear that we are attacking God. I have repeatedly emphasized that the ego does believe it can attack God. That's why it's insane. And tries to persuade you that you have done this. That's why we're filled with unconscious guilt. We believe we have attacked God. If the mind cannot attack, the ego proceeds perfectly logically to the belief that you must be a body. So he's explaining how the ego tricks us. By not seeing you as you are, it can see itself as it wants to be, right? It can trick us. Aware of its weakness, the ego wants your allegiance, but not as you really are, right? The ego wants our allegiance in identifying with ego, but not as we really are, because we really are spirit. The ego, therefore, wants to engage your mind in its own delusional system, because otherwise the light of your understanding would dispel it, right? Our truth would shine the lie away. It wants no part of truth, the ego, because the ego itself is not true. Don't look here, it says. Don't look here. If truth is total, the untrue cannot exist. I love the logic. I love it. You can't miss it. You can't miss the logic. You have to see it once you want to see. So when he says if truth is total, he's talking about spirit. That's our truth. We are total. We are one with one another and with God. And if that's true, which it is, then the untrue cannot exist. There can be nothing outside of the totality, the totality of spirit and oneness. So the ego could never even really exist according to that logic, which is our truth. Commitment to either must be total, right? You're either choosing spirit's perception or ego's perception. Whichever one we choose, we are totally committing to in that now moment. They cannot coexist in your mind without splitting it. That's why we have a split mind. That's how it happened. Because in truth, we really are spirit, but we keep believing this lie of ego, and therefore our mind is split. And that's why we are confused, and that's why we are delusional and insane, when we are allowing our mind to be split by the ego's lies. If they cannot coexist in peace, and if you want peace, you must give up the idea of conflict entirely and for all time. So that means practicing forgiveness so much to the point where you finally completely awaken, just like Jesus did. While you believe that the two totally contradictory thought systems share truth, your need for vigilance is apparent. A fancy way of saying, as long as our mind appears to be split, we need vigilance. Vigilance for spirit, vigilance for God, so that we can return our mind back to peace. Your mind is dividing its allegiance between two kingdoms, right? The kingdom of spirit and the false kingdom of the ego. And you are totally committed to neither. Because as long as our mind is split, we're not fully committed to ego and we're not fully committed to spirit. We're kind of bouncing back and forth between the two, but that's okay. That's the process of awakening. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep practicing. And the more that we reinforce spirit, the more we will awaken our mind and heal that split to bring it back to oneness. Your identification with the kingdom is totally beyond question except by you when you are thinking insanely. So what he's saying is the ego's lies are beyond question because they're not real. They're just lies. They're false. They're meaningless. But only we question it when we are thinking insanely because we are identifying with ego. So our spirit self, the right part of our mind, otherwise known as Holy Spirit, and even Jesus, right? We're all one. These are all just characters speaking to us, telling us our truth. That part of our mind doesn't question our truth, but that split ego part of our mind does question our truth when we are thinking insanely. What you are is not established by your perception and is not influenced by it at all. So even if we're perceiving that we are ego, that we are separate, it doesn't change our truth that we are not those things. The ego perception has zero influence over our truth. Our truth never goes away, even if we're not perceiving it correctly. Perceived problems in identification at any level are not problems of fact. A fancy way of saying if we're perceiving with the ego, we're perceiving things that are false, that are a lie. They are not fact. They are problems of understanding, since their presence implies a belief that what you are is up to you to decide. The ego believes this totally, being fully committed to it. It is not true, he says. The ego, therefore, is totally committed to untruth, perceiving in total contradiction to the Holy Spirit and to the knowledge of God. I love the way he uses so many beautiful words to simply say, hey, wake up. You've made a very silly, stupid mistake. It's completely an illusion. It's completely insane. All you have to do is perceive correctly, and it goes away. The light shines upon the darkness and illuminates the truth. You can be perceived with meaning only by the Holy Spirit because your being is the knowledge of God. That's our truth, he's saying. So the only way that we can perceive and be perceived with any meaning is when we are perceiving with spirit. Any belief you accept apart from this will obscure God's voice in you and will therefore obscure God to you. So again, he's talking about being vigilant for God. If we're not vigilant for God, then God will be hidden from us. Our truth will be hidden from us. So as long as we accept any of the ego's false beliefs of separation, then we will not be at peace. Unless you perceive his creation truly, you cannot know the Creator, since God and his creation are not separate. So that's practicing forgiveness, perceiving oneness, perceiving that we are all the one innocent child of God, perceiving the love that we really all are. The oneness of the Creator and the creation is your wholeness, your sanity, and your limitless power. This limitless power is God's gift to you because it is what you are. If you dissociate your mind from it, you are perceiving the most powerful force in the universe as if it were weak because you do not believe you are a part of it. So if we dissociate our mind from our truth and our true power of spirit, we are mistaken because we are perceiving our most powerful force as weak because we're not really believing that we are one with God. That's how that happens. That's how we get confused. Perceived without your part in it, God's creation is seen as weak. And those who see themselves as weakened do attack, right? Because when we feel weak, we're in fear. That's coming from the ego's belief system. We project out into the world and then we attack. The attack must be blind, however, because there is nothing to attack, right? It's all an illusion. Therefore, they make up images. That's us. That's the ego. It makes up images, perceives them as unworthy, and attack them for their unworthiness. That is exactly what egos do. That is what this world is. That's what makes this world go round. That is all the world of ego is. Nothing. It has no meaning. It does not exist. Do not try to understand it, because if you do, you are believing that it can be understood and is therefore capable of being appreciated and loved. Okay, that's how we get tricked by the ego. That would justify its existence, the ego's existence, which cannot be justified, he says. You cannot make the meaningless meaningful. We're trying real hard. The ego tries real hard, but we can't do it in the end. This can only be an insane attempt. That's it. That's what we're doing. That's what the ego does. That's how this whole world goes round. Our ego identity is constantly trying to make the meaningless meaningful. And that's how we end up not in peace. Allowing insanity to enter your mind means that you have not judged sanity as wholly desirable. If you want something else, you will make something else, but because it is something else, it will attack your thought system and divide your allegiance. You cannot create in this divided state, and you must be vigilant against this divided state, because only peace can be extended. Your divided mind is blocking the extension of the kingdom, and its extension is your joy. If you do not extend the kingdom, you are not thinking with your creator and creating as he created. So more words to say, don't identify with ego and do identify with spirit. This is how we experience peace and love. In this depressing state, the Holy Spirit reminds you gently that you are sad because you are not fulfilling your function as co-creator with God, and are therefore depriving yourself of joy. This is not God's choice, but yours. We have chosen, by splitting our mind with the ego, to deny God's truth, to deny our truth, which brings us joy. If your mind could be out of accord with God's, you would be willing without meaning. Yet because God's will is unchangeable, no conflict of will is possible. This is the Holy Spirit's perfectly consistent teaching. Creation, not separation, is your will because it is God's. And nothing that opposes this means anything at all. Being a perfect accomplishment, the sonship can only accomplish perfectly, extending the joy in which it was created and identifying itself with both its creator and its creations, knowing they are one. More beautiful words to describe practicing forgiveness. When we find ourselves feeling unhappy and not at peace, it's an opportunity for us to observe that we're not feeling at peace, to realize that we have chosen the ego's perception, and that's why we're not at peace. To then be vigilant for God, to realize, oh wait, I can choose again, to use that now moment that you have chosen to focus your mind on spirit, to hold Jesus's hand in those balcony seats of the theater of your mind and see your drama, your character, your story down on that stage, acting out its illusory life, but not identifying with it, not believing it. Sit in those balcony seats with Jesus and observe, or sit in the balcony seats with Holy Spirit. It doesn't matter which character you choose. And it doesn't even have to be Jesus or Holy Spirit. Make up a different one. It doesn't matter. There's only one of us. Use that right part of your mind, the one that wants peace, the one that desires love, true love, wholeness love, oneness love. Keep doing that. Keep practicing. And as we keep doing that, he is explaining to us in this course that this will bring our mind home to peace. The more we focus on truth, the more that the lie disappears.